today we have the privilege of sitting with Rebekah Jones. She's an American geographer, data scientist, and activist whose journey as a whistleblower has captured the attention of a nation. Her courage in exposing critical information during the COVID-19 pandemic has made her a prominent voice in the fight for transparency and accountability. But before we dive into her remarkable story, let's address something important that has come up recently. The film Sound of Freedom, which sheds light on the critical issue of human trafficking, has become a center for controversy. Reports of a QAnon AstroTurf campaign surrounding the film have raised questions about misinformation and the impact it can have on our society. To help us navigate through this complex issue and gain insights from someone who has faced disinfo campaigns firsthand, we're honored to have Rebekah Jones with us today. Welcome, Rebekah.
I am happy to be here.
And you're the very first.
Okay.
So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. It's an absolute honor. Can you walk us through your journey as a whistleblower from managing the COVID-19 dashboard to being granted whistleblower protections?
That's a very long journey.
I know it's a very loaded question.
I didn't actually get legal whistleblower protection until a year after I was fired rather. Which is crazy. I didn't know that you actually had to ask the state to investigate your claim, to substantiate your claim, and then grant you legal whistleblower protection. But if you're a state employee, that's how it works. I was frankly shocked. No one on my legal team expected them to actually investigate themselves and find that they did anything wrong. So I actually have the letter framed up here. Which says, blah, 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 they received a complaint, you allege concerns. We reviewed your complaint to determine if it meets the requirements outlined in the Whistleblower Act. After review of your concerns, this office determined that your complaint does demonstrate reasonable cause to suspect an employee or agent of an agency or independent contractor has violated a federal, state, or local law, rule, or regulation, thereby creating and presenting a substantial and specific danger to the public's health, safety, or welfare.
That letter must have been pure vindication.
I was in Mississippi when I found out, and I got an email from the Inspector General's office first, and then the attachment later. And we were actually filming for the documentary about all of the stuff that's happened to me when I got that email. Which just, I guess, was pure luck for the director's part. But I was with my mom and my sister, and they had seen everything that I had gone through, and obviously know me very well. And I cried a lot on camera. I tried not to do that too much, because then you get painted as emotional or crazy or whatever. But yeah, I couldn't believe it. I think in some ways, getting actual legal protection as a state employee is very difficult to do. It's not automatic. They have to investigate first. It took them almost 6 months to do that. It would have been nice to have had that before the raid on my house, which was in December.
Definitely.
But it did make me feel safer. And when I got that letter, I actually decided that I couldn't just abandon Florida because we moved right after the raid, and that I was going to come back and fight. And so we did. We moved back. I lost that fight. Can't win them all. I ran against Matt Gaetz in the most Republican district in the state. But it was worth it.
You've obviously been through a lot as a whistleblower. How has it shaped your perspective on the importance of transparency and data accuracy in public health?
I come from a background in climatology. We never really had to deal with people's personal health information. So in this context, it was a new kind of dilemma for me. But the level of not just data transparency and how you're collecting things and, how it's being reported, but access to data is unquestioned within climate science. Everything we do is public. Like every paper that we write, the reviewers have to review the raw data, recreate the analysis, and come to the same results. that's just part of it, because climate has been this kind of magnet for disinformation and for political attacks. And so as scientists, we were always aware that we were subject to critical review from everybody. And health, obviously, it can't be quite that extreme. I dealt a lot with, HIV data, which is very sensitive. It's actually in its own special class of health data because of how sensitive it is considered. We deal with infectious data and people's personal health files. And so we can't just share all of that, obviously. I had developed a way of sharing as much information as possible without anybody being identified. And I thought that it was incredibly important to keep doing that and to do it as honestly as possible. I had a massive document that I had built while I was working there that detailed every single data field that we were publishing, how exactly that data was gathered and what it meant and how it should not be interpreted. So the pitfalls of it. So we were kind of forced to start publishing racial data. But as my colleague Scott Pritchard said at the time, it was shit data. That's how he referred to it. And most of it was incomplete. So, but the president wanted us to start sharing racial data because he apparently was under the impression that the virus impacts every community the same, which is not true. It's never true. In a natural disaster situation, that is never true. So we were forced to publish it. But the problem is most of that data field was blank. And so people were using the fact that we had, maybe more white people filled in the form than Black people do for various cultural reasons. And that, it was impacting white people disproportionately, and therefore racism isn't real. And that was a wildly inappropriate response because most of the time we were not collecting data. And you could actually run the data from, or I could, I guess public couldn't, people's zip codes of where the data was incomplete and see that they were in majority communities. And so we knew that was not a correct summary of what we were publishing, but it didn't stop anybody from doing it. So in my massive data document, I detailed all of that kind of information. Like, this is the percent of racial data that's incomplete or unknown or was filled out incorrectly because it would have something that was a code that didn't exist for race because it was a fill-in type thing and not a choice pull down, which I advocated for but didn't get. But I was like, we keep getting people spelling things wrong and different capitalization. And as a person who's coding all of this, every time I have to deal with that, it makes things very frustrating. It is very hard to balance those things because the only people who had the raw data were like myself and my epi team. And we knew what we couldn't say, but of course there are people above us who decided how that stuff would be used.
So as far as data goes, I am somebody who absolutely loves data. I will take all the data I can get, but data in itself is less than half of the battle. There is so much more beyond that. The interpretation is most of it. But on the subject of climate, I've read that your experiences during Hurricane Katrina influenced your interest in natural disasters. How did those experiences impact your work in the field of geography and data science?
Initially, I was actually in quite a few storms before that. Close call with a tornado when I was a kid in Pennsylvania, just months before we moved. And then the year that we moved down to Mississippi from Pennsylvania, Hurricane George hit, I saw this alligator farm had apparently overflooded and there were alligators in the street in a town that was called Gaucher, but it was spelled like Gautier. And so I was in a strange place with alligators swimming down the streets. I certainly had an interest in weather before that, in geography and geology. But Katrina, I was 16. So right about the time where I'm thinking about where I want to go to college. And
I mean, everyone around the globe knows of Katrina and the devastating effect of it.
I was a woke child, I guess you could say, from a very young age. That opened my eyes to a lot of things that I had, as just a kid, never really seen. And that's true for Katrina in this country in a lot of ways. I didn't initially want to go into the actual climate science. I wanted to be a journalist. I snuck past the barricades down in Gulfport, and with my mom, I made her do it after the National Guard line so I could get pictures of some of the devastation and write about it. And I went to Syracuse because they have the best communication school in the country, thinking I was going to be a journalist. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be thrown in the worst places in the world to tell the stories about the people on the ground there that nobody else cared to even ask about. Under the umbrella of journalism, I guess it was voice to the voiceless, is what my dean used to say. And I was committed to that. And then unexpectedly, unplanned, and albeit unwanted, my sophomore year, I got pregnant and decided, after considering adoption, to keep my son. Realized having him that writing about all of the horrible things that were happening in the world, most of which centered on environmental issues, everything from resource rights that start wars to, not having water, famine, or storms. It wasn't enough. I didn't want to be a passive absorber or a transcriber of disaster. I wanted to help prevent it. And so I had been a double major in environmental science and I finished both of the majors, leaned heavily into that, and then went into grad school at LSU because they had the Regional Climate Center there. They had the Southern Climate Impacts Planning Program there, had a lot of crossover between climate science research and communications, and I followed that through. Hang on one sec. My cat is making a lot of noise. So it's a bag. And so naturally the cat wants to be in the bag, and it was shut. So
I have a parrot, so if you hear any screaming in the background, I promise nobody is being stabbed in the background. It's just a bird.
That is a podcast first for me.
Yep. You might hear him.
No one's dying. It's just a bird.
If he starts up, I'll bring him as proof. How do you see technology playing a role in improving disaster response and public health planning?
As a data nerd, someone who has very obviously utilized technology and tools that it enables to communicate effectively, there are almost no limits on how we can utilize technology as a tool to help us respond better and plan better for disasters before they happen, and then respond to them. So for several storms, I worked in a rapid response disaster team that was contracted out through a company in California, but they took on grad students and stuff like that to do contract work because we were cheap. They wouldn't have to pay us as much, but we were just as good as anybody else. And what we basically did was, immediately after a storm, there's always aerial imagery that's flown over, high quality aerial imagery documenting everything. You can have that like the next day. And so we were going through, and basically after Hurricane Sandy, is that 2012?
So they would fly I remember that vividly.
Yeah. They would fly a stretch, get the reel, and then one of us would go through and mark houses that were damaged and how extreme the damage was. This allowed us to help them prioritize response efforts. If we were going through an area where all the houses were, let's say, a level 4 or 5 destruction, which is near or totally destroyed, then they knew that's where they needed to go first to make sure that, people were safe, or if they weren't, that there was recovery of bodies.
Like houses right down to the foundation.
Yes. That storm didn't have too many of those, just because the storm surge and the topography of the coastline was a little different. It wasn't like Hurricane Michael or Katrina that just leveled everything.
But having that imagery must be incredibly helpful as far as being able to make that response.
Yeah, and we did that. I did it with them for several storms, including the Moore, Oklahoma tornadoes that were very bad the next year. And then I led those efforts during Hurricane Michael while I was at the Department of Health, because I'd done it so many times before and they needed it quickly. So I was there. I was like, hey, guess what? You actually have somebody who knows how to do this. This is great. That data was utilized by the New York Times for an amazing graphic that they did about the destruction. But we had a lot of people missing in Michael, and it really helped us target when people were missing, whether or not we thought those odds were good. If they were in a house that was 3 blocks away, then nobody's heard from them, and they didn't register in a database, and they weren't in a shelter, that wasn't good. But at any rate, it also helped us identify bodies. But we did that. And then for the one that hit the Northeast, we also had mined social media for pictures of the flooding to get flood depth analysis. And that helped us coordinate with sewage flow to see if there were areas that might have water overflowing that contained sewage based on what types of sewage system it was. So a lot of places in the Northeast still have something called a combined sewage overflow system, which means that the rainwater goes into the same sewer system as sewage. And if there's too much in there
The
and it
overflow.
bubbles back up into the street, yeah, that's not great. So targeting those areas with flood depths to see how we could allocate resources for that. A lot of stuff based on pictures of where the flood line was. It's made responding to disasters incredibly effective. I can guarantee you they wish they had all of that stuff in the Indian Ocean earthquake to assess damages from the tsunami and coordinate rescue efforts. That's just part of it. And how we communicate is much more effective when we have efficient tools and technology to do. I fully leaned into that and embraced that the whole pandemic. Continue to do so even after I was fired, with schools data nationwide and with Florida with all of its other data. I think that in the future, we're going to see integration of technology for disasters make things, response at least, incredibly efficient if it's used properly.
I kind of want to veer back to your time as a whistleblower. Well, I guess you're still a whistleblower. There is no time as a whistleblower. Your case has sparked debates about protections for whistleblowers and government accountability. What changes do you think are necessary to better support and protect whistleblowers in the future?
There are a myriad of laws that protect whistleblowers in this country, depending on the type of employee that you are. So if you work for a company and you are, let's say, like Sharon Watkins from Enron, and you are informing, the FEC of, not sorry, the FEC, who was it? Whoever you go to file complaints about economic mishandling.
It's different in Canada, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, that's a separate class of whistleblower and of protections. If you're a federal employee, you most likely have the best protections in the country. But if you're a state employee, it's really up to the state how many protections are granted to you and how they decide to grant them. The fact is that nobody likes a whistleblower in the institution that they're blowing the whistle on. Government, least of all. It's not easy. So like in Florida, like I said, they had to investigate it for almost 6 months to decide that I was a legitimate whistleblower and I deserved to be protected. And this was 1 year after I was fired, almost 6 months after the raid on my house, an armed raid where they pointed guns at my children and threatened to shoot them. So it came too late. It's supposed to be a 90-day turnaround, and it was a year. There's no way to really enforce that unless you are ready to sue them. But if you sue them, they're going to issue an unfavorable decision because they're going to say, oh, well, we just don't have enough time to investigate, so we're going to have to deny it. There's really nothing you can do. And I think there needs to be, and there was an attempt to make better laws to protect people who work for state governments who want to blow the whistle in their state. So they're not subject to whatever the state powers that they're blowing the whistle on, to decide whether or not they're legitimate. It's mind-boggling to me that there were no federal protections. They passed the COVID Whistleblower Act a month after I was raided. I actually met with Jamie Raskin. Well, that was when Biden took over, so that's why it happened. I spoke to Jamie Raskin about it. I had this great conversation. He was talking about how I was the reason why they wanted to push it so hard. And I mean, I helped make a law, so that's great, but it still only applies to federal employees and their contractors. It wouldn't have done anything to help me.
Yeah, it doesn't apply at the state level.
No. And when there are lives at stake, that's not good. I think what they wanted to do and what they were quite successful in accomplishing was put me through so much hell just for, I didn't even go out publicly. They were the ones who outed me just for saying no to doing one bad thing that no one else would ever consider speaking out ever again. And publicly, they've been pretty successful on that. If you read all the articles that have been written about everything that happened on COVID, they all cite anonymous sources within the agency. For the big whistleblower story that the Miami Herald wrote about me, I think they talked to 20 some other employees, some of the ones I gave to them, other ones they spoke to. None of them were willing to put their name on the record, but they were all willing to back up my story. And that is how it works. As soon as somebody says, oh, people requested not to be named out of fear of retaliation, they're like, oh, so they're just a coward. We can't even verify this person said these things or even works there. Of course, the newspaper does that. It makes it very difficult when you're standing alone in front of a crowd of faceless anonymous sources to kind of be the person who has to represent all of this.
And the person
And
standing up for what is actually right.
and they did too. I mean, speaking to the press is risky. Even if you think that, you're not going to be caught doing it, the consequences of doing it are absolutely, you're going to be fired. Good luck trying to get a positive recommendation from them after that. So it's risky, and they did take a risk. But I go back and forth all the time between being angry that people didn't speak out and being sympathetic that I didn't really choose to speak out either. Like my plan was to file my complaint anonymously, and no one knew who I was. So
And then they dragged your name through the streets.
yeah. And if I was asked to speak out for someone else and I had seen them go through what I went through, and I still had a job and my privacy, and I wasn't being threatened all the time,
It's a
I
huge
don't know that
deterrent.
I would do it. I don't know that I would do it. So sometimes I'm angry. I was like, you should not have let me suffer through all of this on my own. And other times I'm like,
I kind of get it.
who would willingly subject themselves to this for
Yeah.
someone else?
So, what are some of the insights you gained while handling and analyzing the data from the COVID pandemic?
Well, there's a lot. I wrote about it almost every single day. Some of the things that stuck out to me the most were probably the biggest policy mistakes that were made. So, reopening schools was a mistake. We know that all the data shows that whatever fear of like the long-term learning loss was greatly over exaggerated, and that there was not a significant gap between those places that returned to school and those places who didn't, but it cost a lot of lives. And there was one Texas study that looked specifically at the cost of reopening schools in their state. And there were thousands of people who died just in the first few months just because they opened schools. This whole idea that this incubator of viruses, because if anyone has a child, they know that if one person is sick in that school, all the kids are going to come home with it. You're going to get every stomach bug, you're going to get the flu, you're going to get the common cold, you're going to get conjunctivitis, you're going to get everything. That somehow COVID would just stop. A highly infectious disease would just stop at the doors. And not only stop, but people like DeSantis banned schools from requiring masks for those who did go back to school. And the insanity around gambling with our children and their future, to me, was just baffling. At first, we didn't really have enough data, but here's the thing about that is like, you don't make risky decisions when you don't have any data. That's almost as bad as making a risky decision when the data is maybe not so favorable, because you don't know what's going to happen. And when you're dealing with vulnerable people, you can't do that. And that's, of course, not even to say the impact that it had on students whose teachers died or whose school staff, their principal or other people who work in the school died as a result of catching COVID at their job. There are no protections for teachers or staff members in schools, at least not in Florida. Nothing national because, Trump was president while schools were reopening in 2020. And it just, to me, that was the most egregious part of the anti-science narrative, was that the kids are not affected by COVID, which is a lie, that it wouldn't contribute to community spread, which was outrageous and a lie, and that it was worth it, which is a lie. It was always a
we're
lie.
even in Ontario here, we've now dropped our mask mandates for hospitals, which you think it's a hospital.
We have to.
Why are we normalizing having airborne diseases in a place where we are treating sick people and the most vulnerable people?
Yeah, I kind of hope that some of these mask mandates sort of stay permanent. Health care should be the place where that does. I'd like to see more data on the percentage of people who go to the ER for infectious or contagious diseases. The flu is a common thing that's treated at the ER. I don't have it, but I'd like to see it, because that seems like people come in with a broken arm and now they're going to have the flu too. That's just great. That worked out well. Of course, COVID is not the only, as I mentioned, the flu, the only airborne virus that's out there, the only contagious or infectious virus that's out there. And I really hoped we would have kept on to that one. But, this is, I think America, and I guess Canada as well, are in such a rush, our governments, to make it look like we beat COVID. COVID is past, COVID is history, that we are enacting these policies that first are more likely than not going to allow it to start spreading again, as if it stopped, which it did not. Florida's, I believe, was 15% positivity in their last week report, so which is higher than the 10% that I was fired for not making every county look like it had in order to reopen in the first place. It's really about looking like a victor over the disease and not actually having a victory over the disease. We got used to it and became numb to it.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. And now it's just people are acting like it's a common cold. I caught it a few months ago for the very first time. I managed to avoid it up until this point, and it floored me. And I'm still feeling the effects of it months later.
First time I thought I got it, I thought I was going to die. I passed out in a hotel room. Of course, I had to go to jail for a night, which is super fun, sick with COVID. Second time I got it was not as bad, but I already been vaccinated, but it did knock me out for a couple days. The flu can kick your ass as well, but people like look back on the 1918 influenza and be like, oh, well, we beat that. No, we didn't. You know, that H1N1 and H1N3 and all those things that kind of circulate. It's the same type of virus that was around in 1918. We did the same thing, and it made people sicker, and it never went away.
I want to talk about the AstroTurf campaign surrounding Sound of Freedom.
It's crazy.
How did you become aware of this campaign? What are your thoughts when you first noticed it gaining traction?
So it's actually your tweet at first, with the
I'm
video
honored.
with the of the manager, I think, or somebody at a theater talking about how there was nobody there, even though it was sold out. It was, I think you were included in a video by this influencer named Tizzy. He's been very supportive of me, so I see most of his stuff. And I watched it and I was like, that's kind of funny. I didn't really think much about it at first. I'm busy fighting a different kind of war. And QAnon is so crazy that I try to avoid it as much as possible. I saw it, and then I saw the responses that y'all were getting. And Jim Stewartson, who is a QAnon researcher, he's the one who figured out that the people behind it are Joseph and Mike Flynn and Steve Bannon and Roger Stone and all those Trump people. He wrote something about it, and of course he's deep in it. And I was like, you know what? Like, maybe it's true. I'm going to go find out. I was going out that way anyways. So I bought a ticket to go see something else and was like, I'll just pop in real quick and then see if there's anybody there and then leave. Yeah, there's nobody there. Nobody there. And then of course, a couple of strange things happened after that. I had my ticket stub. Like, I took a picture of it.
You brought
and
receipts.
It was like, it was a printed one too, which you can only get at the theater. And I had the screenshot of my ticket as well, and the theater at the exact same time with the showing and the sold out theater and all that crap. You know, people will still try to debunk it, but that they actually changed tune very, very quickly, because the second time I did it, there were a couple people in there, but it was not full. The people that I straight up asked, I made sure my watch was pulled up and everything, so nobody can say, oh, I went there an hour after or whatever they were saying. Asked them what they were there to see and what time I was supposed to start. And, you know, it was after the scheduled start time. I was going to see Barbie like 5 minutes later. And so I was like, I'm just gonna do this quick. It was mostly empty. It was supposed to be sold out, and it was maybe 85-90% empty. I think that when you reach that kind of level of multiple verification, it became hard to dispute it. So instead they pivoted, and there were two crazy things that came after it. Well, I guess the first one's not so crazy. Apparently the studio bought something like 1 million or 2 million tickets that they're advertising that they're giving away to free to anybody who wants it, so that we poor folk can go see it for free. That is astroturfing. That is a level of astroturfing. That means that at least 1 million, I think it was 2, but at least 1 million of those ticket sales were from the studio. So all of these people reporting that, it's been sold out or the surprise hit, it's like 1 million of those tickets was purchased by the studio. And I'm kind of doubtful that maybe they did that because, or at least as transparently or for that reason, because who the hell rejects free tickets when it's like the hottest week in history of this planet? to go sit in a freezing cold theater for 3 hours. I don't even really care what it is. I'd probably take a free ticket to something. Yet nobody's showing up. Nobody's taking these free tickets. But the really crazy thing was when they started a conspiracy that what I did was proof that theaters themselves are falsely reporting that the movie is sold out to prevent anyone from seeing it. I was like, oh my God,
The
I'm
mental
sorry, guys.
gymnastics
I did
required
this.
to come
That's
up
not
with
what I'm
that.
saying. And like QAnon people were sharing my stuff, being like, oh my God, look, the theater is lying to people saying don't go see this movie. I was like, oh my God, I walked right in. They were playing it. I could have sat there and watched the whole thing. There were no armed guards. There was no locked door. That's insane. You sound insane. You need help.
One of the biggest
And
mistakes I made was posting saying that my buddy actually turned off the air conditioning for 2 showings because no one was there. So suddenly that became a conspiracy that everywhere was
yeah,
shutting off the air conditioning to prevent people from going in.
had so many problems in movies that them thinking that they're like personally being targeted for this is insane. There was one movie I took my son to, it was years ago, and it just stopped working like 25 minutes in, and they were like,
It happens
we're
all the
gonna have
time
to
at theaters.
we're gonna have to give you vouchers to come back another time. I was like, well, I don't do that, but it happens. And it just, of course, but they're perpetual victims and they're conspiracy theorists. So there's always a conspiracy to do something to hurt them, which really is the foundation of the film itself, which perpetuates this myth that on every street corner there is a kidnapper waiting to take and traffic your young children into some underground network of things. Not that international sex trafficking does not happen, it does. I've had personal experience with that. It really kind of forms the foundation of what QAnon is as a whole, which is these underground networks of kidnapping and trafficking children. And then of course it goes off way into the crazy train.
What exactly motivated you to go and check on Sound of Freedom, knowing that there is this campaign against people speaking up against it?
I think the campaign was what motivated me. I don't really care whether or not a movie's, ticket sales are inflated or inauthentic, but I did notice the unusual activity, especially inauthentic accounts on Twitter, targeting people who said anything about it. And for me, as somebody who tracks disinformation and inauthentic, account activity on Twitter, that to me was like, okay, well, if they're trying this hard to attack and defame and, just relentlessly harass anyone who even suggests that maybe something weird is going on, then it's worth looking into. Like I said, I was going out that way anyways. It was $7 Tuesdays. I didn't really lose much. Now, if it was a normal day and time, a normal 15.98 or whatever it is, I might have been a little more hesitant. I know people who have invested their lives into trying to inform people about QAnon, knowing that they were involved in seeing the attacks that you and Tizzy and Jim Stewartson were dealing with. I was like, all right, I'll just check it out for myself. Maybe it's just a fluke thing that a couple people caught. Maybe it's fake. I don't know, but I'll go see, find out.
I'm a relatively small Twitter user. I don't have a huge following, but I consider myself a consumer of information. How can someone like myself combat these false narratives, and how do we become more critical of news and information?
Should always be critical of the news. Everything from the stories that they choose to cover to the specific language they put in the headline to reporter biases based on life experience or lack thereof. You should always question news, especially television news. Print's a little better,
Not
but
in
when you have
Canada.
to fill 24 hours a day with something, and you're competing against multiple other networks doing the same thing, it's I'm not a fan of the television media. I'll just put it that way. Always make sure that what you're reading, that there's original sources, that there's something that you can verify, that they don't use words like some say, so and so. It's like, who are the some? Tell me the some. I want to know who the some are, because otherwise you just said it. But as far as dealing with these people, oh God, I don't know that I have any good advice for that. I used to have this almost Teflon type armor where I never gave a shit. I mean, I didn't see most of the stuff that was being said because I was busy. running numbers every day for COVID. And so I didn't really pay much attention to it. And most of the interactions I had were positive. And so the negative stuff didn't bother me, but something changed at some point and it bothers me more now. I pretty much they make it really easy on Twitter to hide and block comments at the same time as one button. So most of the time, if I see somebody being an ass or just being rude or
Just
harassing
goodbye.
me or calling me sweet tits, I had one of those today.
Oh,
Yeah, it's like that. Bye. I don't give a shit. I'm not gonna remember who you were. Half a second later, and you're off my timeline. Go create 5 more accounts to say the same thing. But I think really remembering that most of that is inauthentic activity. It's not real people. If this movie was that popular, it would actually be sold out. If their movement was that popular, they would have won re-election for Trump, and they didn't. And it's an illusion. It's the reason why Ron DeSantis's campaign is failing so poorly, because he's lived in a digital sphere where he's bought, according to Chris Boozy, who runs Bot Sentinel, over 100,000 fake accounts just to follow him and tweet his stuff in a single purchase, in a single 2-day period. So it's not real. It's important to remember the people that are, stay grounded in the sanity of what is true. Because, I mean, especially when you're dealing with something like QAnon, you can try to rationalize it, but when it's that extreme, it's not possible. It's a cult. I mean, I had people like, that movie theater's not even playing that movie. And I'm like, but here's the website. Yeah, I was like, here's the website too. You can look at it, and they just could not believe it. And then they, of course, spun it into the alternative conspiracy theory eventually. Oh, well, they're keeping us out. I was like, oh my God, I'm a liar for saying that this theater is showing the movie, which you can verify on the theater website. And at the same time, they're lying about the lie that I told. I don't know. It's
a lot of mental gymnastics.
Yes, it is. And so focusing your time and your energy on things that matter, on, informing people of things that are accurate is really the only coping method that I've found that works. And occasionally tell one to fuck off. That kind of feels good.
Yeah, it does feel good to just let out on those accounts every once in a while. How do filmmakers maintain some form of integrity with their work if this is what's going on? If we can't really trust television media and, to a lesser extent, print media?
Production companies want to make money from movies. That's what they make them for. If a movie is not going to make money, they don't make the movie. So buying your own tickets, it's a loss. You lose the money that you spent making the film, and then you're losing all the money that you are astroturfing the film. The only reason that I think this is so large scale is partly because of the people who are behind it and the ultimate goal of this movie, which is as like I said, gateway drug to QAnon. Of course, Donald Trump had a special screening at Mar-a-Lago of The Sound of Freedom and has viciously attacked anybody who criticizes it. And so there's a very clear motivation for wanting to expose people to what, by all accounts, is a very intense emotional film. There's probably no more base feeling that a human can feel as a parent, especially, than seeing a child in danger or harmed. And it's we're biologically wired to want to protect children. Playing on that is playing to our greatest fear. And that's smart. It's very smart. The people who are behind this are very smart.
It was chosen very, very intentionally and very carefully.
Yes. I mean, the Russians developed it with Mike Flynn and Roger Stone in the 90s, and Jim Stewartson has all that stuff, of course. It's crazy that caring about children is being exploited as a way to get support for an impeached, never democratically elected former president who's facing a litany of felony charges and possibly prison time for trying to overthrow a democratic election in which he lost. That's the angle. And that's why they'll pay the money to fill the seats. Otherwise, this would not happen. And maybe they anticipated that if they filled it up and got enough buzz around it, that people would really start seeing it. That might change over time. I don't know. But I would be interested to see data from movie theaters about how many seats were sold versus how many people scanned and checked in. I don't know that they will do that, but I would be interested to see it.
Yeah, I feel like it's important to note that I don't think anybody needed a movie to know that child trafficking and human trafficking is a real thing. But this movie paints it in a way that it's very clearly designed to be able to target people who speak out against it based on the content of this movie.
And introduce them to the next step of QAnon, which is the Hollywood elites and Democratic politicians who are financing these underground child trafficking rings for the purpose. And every time I say this, I cannot believe I'm being literal and not exaggerating or adding color, for sexual abuse, torture, and draining of their blood, which they then consume because they believe that it will make them live forever. And the kicker is that for some reason of all people, Donald Trump is the only one who can save us from them. The closer you can get people to believing that there are everywhere around us people waiting to kidnap and rape children and transfer them around, then you're one step closer to QAnon.
I've
But the
seen
fact of the
campy horror movies that are more believable than the QAnon conspiracy theories that they're pushing.
I don't know, I'm gonna get shit if I say this, but Scientology is almost equally ridiculous.
Uh,
But people follow it and
they
lose their
do.
lives in it. So it's a cult. Cults don't make sense. Calling Scientology a religion is ridiculous. It is a cult. Then again, you could start debating about how all religion is cult, and that believing that the literal son of God turned water into wine is a little bit outrageous as well and came back from the dead. I mean, it's all fantastical.
That's a great way to put it.
It's without being too condescending to people of faith, because don't need to go down that road.
Religion can be a powerful tool if you use it for the lessons it teaches and not for.
Not all those lessons are so great though.
No, they're not. They're aged. They're very aged, and it's like the world's longest game of
Stoning people
telephone.
was like never a good thing. I don't
Yeah.
care what age you were in. Yeah, it's certainly been probably the largest source of deaths that you can attribute to a single entity is probably organized religion. Anyways, we don't want to go down that rabbit hole.
That's
Let's not
a
go down that one.
whole different
We
topic.
don't need to have all of the world coming after us. Everybody already knows I'm an atheist. I don't care. When I'm talking about crazy idea, whether or not it's underground vampire cults that Donald Trump is the Lord and Savior of, or it's Scientology, which I cannot even repeat without sounding ridiculous, or turning water into wine, walking on water, coming back from the dead, parting the Red Sea, all that stuff. To me, it all sounds absurd. But to some people, that is
And when
evidence of
David
God's
Blaine does
work.
it, it is absurd.
Is he still alive?
Oh, I don't know.
I don't know either. Okay. But anyways, what was
So,
the question? We're talking about why they do this.
Yeah.
I really think that it's not a normal thing to happen. It's because movie theaters need to make money. Otherwise, they're not going to make movies. Hollywood is full of rich people who, like your Harvey Weinsteins, who, smartly invest in films that they believe can be mass marketed and earn them a crap ton of money. If it doesn't, then they don't do it. And so occasionally you get like a big picture flop, but they're well known when they flop. So it's not like their goal.
So you have freedom of speech in the US. We have freedom of expression in Canada. I don't want to say they're similar, but it's the same general idea. How do social media companies moderate content without impeding on freedom of speech or freedom of expression?
So in America, and I don't know what it is in Canada, the First Amendment gives you freedom of speech from government persecution. It does not apply to anything else. It just means that the government cannot throw you in jail for saying something. And even that has limitations. There's the famous court case in America. You can't scream fire in a crowded theater, cause a panic, and which leads to people being harmed or killed. Not all speech is protected. There is very much an active, ongoing debate about whether or not private companies or publicly traded, whatever you want to refer to them as, have any social responsibility in making sure that the products that they produce, let's say Twitter, are not being used to spread disinformation or hate in the simplest terms. And most people, I think, depending on which side of the aisle, they may have different ideas of what this means, but most people agree that there should be some kind of moderation of content. Like, you should not be able to upload snuff videos to Twitter. That's snuff videos, if anybody knows, are videos of people like actually dying, or things that are criminal. We don't want to allow that. We don't want to allow child porn on Twitter. If we're going to say that all movies are free speech, then you're going to get into the discussion, the uncomfortable discussions about what is porn and whether or not that should be allowed. And specifically, isn't saying that you, I don't even want to go down that road with the child porn thing, but it's gross. But we all collectively agreed that those things are wrong and that they shouldn't be on something like Twitter. Where we start to diverge is more centered on the political speech part. Apparently, in America over the last few years, certain things have become protected political speech that previously were considered harassment or unprotected speech. Normally, the rules in society are that if somebody was a Nazi and they started talking about killing the Jews, we would shun that person as a culture
I
and
miss those days.
effectively silence them by not giving them the attention that they seek and not rewarding them for trying to want to kill the Jews. That kind of societal rule is kind of broken. I actually had somebody post on one of my things today the screenshots of when she reported someone specifically saying that they wanted all the Jews to die, and Twitter determined it was not a violation of its terms of service, which I don't even think anybody works at Twitter safety anymore. I think that was part of the office that he fired.
Yeah, I think
so
Apartheid Elmo is pretty much axed everybody there.
And promotes the people and accounts that are sharing this kind of thing. While other websites like Facebook have made some improvements on things that are considered offensive based on protected class. So, which is usually the things that you don't choose. So race, gender, sexuality, things like that. You can't be disparaging towards people because of their identity as a protected class. Twitter doesn't do that. And I think they should. There is a law that was passed in the 90s, so pre-Twitter, pre-social media, AOL dial-up days, that is called Section 230, and it grants absolute immunity to social media companies for all of the content that is transmitted through their site. The idea was, at the time, it's actually called the Communications Modernization Act, which, maybe 30 years later, we should revisit that, because companies like AOL and Yahoo did not feel that they should be responsible for people who send emails that content of which could break the law. For that, there's a better argument, because of course, if I send an email to Google that has, kitty porn attached to it, I should go to jail, not Google. Google should not be held responsible. They can't do anything if it's not, there's no way to moderate that once just the act of sending an email. But times have changed. And the argument for that kind of conduct, especially after January 6th, in which Twitter was used to coordinate an insurrection against the United States, have, or at least should have, be reconsidered. I personally think anything that would be considered criminal in real world should be considered criminal online, and any company that facilitates criminal should be held responsible if they are warned and they choose not to act. So I have a very dedicated cyber gang that does nothing but stalk and harass me on Twitter. They've doxed me more times than I can even count. I still have screenshots where my address is just right there, that were not a violation of terms of service. I was actually off Twitter for 18 months, my entire congressional campaign. They suspended me the week before I announced, restored it like 2 weeks after the election was over, and it didn't stop. One of them shared pictures of the house that I was living in that were taken while I was still living there. And the layout of it was insane.
That is so terrifying.
There was nothing I could do. And that kind of level would be considered criminal harassment. But Twitter doesn't even consider it targeted harassment. There are accounts that exist there to do nothing other than harass anyone who even mentions me. Don't even have to tag me, because of TweetDeck. They can see every mention of keywords and they put my name in there and will literally go and attack people. I wouldn't be surprised if you got a message from one of these people just telling you, oh, you seem like you're, interested in the good fight. I just didn't want you to be, deceived by her. She's got this in her past. I'm just trying to look out for you. It happens all the time. People send me, it's like a template that they have. That's insane. And it's abuse. And I shouldn't have to tolerate it. I recently found out that I can get paid for tolerating it. So this kind of changed my
So Twitter
perspective a little
blue.
bit. Yeah. I mean, with the amount of activity I get, maybe I can start actually taking money from the people who are trying to hurt me and my family. It still should not be allowed to happen.
It is just such a
And
toxic cesspool.
if that was real life and people did that, they would be arrested. And so I do believe that a company like Twitter has a responsibility to make sure that criminal activity does not continue on their website. There are other conversations to have about that can span all kinds of things, like why in the world the privacy screens no longer work on Twitter. I'd like to know why, because now when I open it, it's just porn. Like I
It's
literally opened
horrible.
the app this morning to seeing a woman looking another woman's asshole. And I was like, what the fuck? I was like, minors use this, children use this
It's
website.
crazy.
We're
It's
so
taken
protect
such
the
a
children,
downhill
yet you
turn.
open it up and then there's porn.
Yep.
It's disgusting. I guess they didn't pay their server or whatever that's supposed to like flag that stuff, or at least that's what someone told me. And that kind of, you don't have to censor porn. I didn't even know Twitter had porn until recently, requiring it to have a sensitivity filter and suspending people who repeatedly fail to mark their content as graphic or, we're not pornographic. Other arguments about whether or not you can say the N word or, whether you can say all Jews must die, which apparently is okay. But I get warned every time I tweet the word fuck.
Or
Like, it's
idiot.
like, oh, a lot of people don't like this. And I was like, are you fucking kidding? Like, that was my result. I was like, are you fucking kidding me right now with this shit? Oh, fuck. Like, are you, oh my God, the stuff that I have to deal with, and you're telling me that
Like is
fuck
this grade
offends
1
people?
now?
Yeah, it's insane. So there is the alt-right people think it's this gold mine. And that's why you see like the Young Turks, who used to be known as a fairly progressive and liberal media outlet, taking a hard right turn recently. It's why CNN is going far right. It's, why Twitter is going far right, is because they think it's a gold mine and they don't get it. They do not understand the media landscape.
And
Elon
I feel like
Musk
the
doesn't
landscape
understand it.
is made to be like that though, because up here in Canada we have Post Media, which owns almost every newspaper and every outlet out there, and they are owned by an American hedge fund, and every single one of them has conservative leaning views. So
We have
what
that.
everyone
No, I was going to say we have that too. We have Gannett, which owns most of the newspapers, and we have Sinclair, which owns most of your local affiliate TV stations. Somebody in the Republican Party smartened up a couple years ago, maybe more than a decade, saw newspapers were collapsing and they needed money and they were selling. And so they bought them all up for a really great price. And now they control all of the content that is shared in every small and medium-sized town in Florida and a lot in other states. And Sinclair did the same thing with local TV stations.
I think
and
we've all
so,
seen the Sinclair script,
yes,
that video.
exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, and so they realize that if they can control information, they control the narrative and the story, and that is more powerful in influencing how people think and consequently as they vote than giving to, Rick Scott's campaign donation. It's about rewiring America, and they did it by controlling information.
And a lot of
And
that information is being pushed by bots and AI that have been specifically designed to push that exact message. So that's obviously a negative. What do you
yes.
think? What do you think is an emerging positive trend that technology could play a part in?
In social media?
Yeah.
It is really hard to find a positive trend in social media. First of all, I think people hating on Elon Musk, who I'm no fan of, he had personally came after me and my son. So I guess he didn't appreciate me getting named Forbes Tech Person of the Year. And then he went and bought Times Person of the Year the next year. There's a whole history there. People hating on Elon Musk and his weirdness and what he's doing to the site, and then running into the arms of Mark Zuckerberg on Threads. That to me is a very disturbing trend. We're talking about people are upset about how it's impacting elections and, sharing disinformation. It's like, did everyone forget Facebook's role in 2016? And all of the things that they've done, and the other billionaire who's crazy and weird, and we're just gonna hop on his thing now. That's what we're gonna do. Okay, whatever. I think Spoutable is the best alternative app that's out there. It's run by a guy who knows what he's talking about, whose background is in, dissecting disinformation. He runs Bot Sentinel. Unfortunately, the problem is that unless you can immediately gain all of the followers that you have on Twitter, it's going to be very hard to convince influential people on those sites to go to another one and start from scratch. It's hard. That's a problem. I think the trend of seeing a lot of alternatives pop up is good. Some have kind of looked like they were going to go somewhere and didn't. Mastodon is probably I was trying to warn people, this is not going to work. You guys are
I
doing this
avoided that one like the plague.
requiring way too much from your users as far as tech savviness and the different servers, and just no. Tribal's decent, but people are starting to explore other ways that we can do this and maybe not have Nazis. And that's good. That's the
Ideally.
only good thing. Yeah. Well, ideally, like we used to, we could go back.
Yeah.
But I think the only good trend is that in all of those alternatives, people are realizing that we don't have to tolerate this, and that we can choose something better if the company that's behind the thing we're using doesn't want to do the bare minimum of what we expect. That, what I say, is the only positive trend.
Yeah, I think it's pretty hard to come across a really positive trend that has come out of social media the last while. It used to be that Twitter was this magnificent thing that connected everybody, and you could use it for getting weather alerts, for example, and keeping up to date with stuff like that. And it's just become such a cesspool. And like you said, it's difficult to move from platform to platform unless you're able to bring that audience with you.
And especially for people who, let's say their audiences are like mine, shaped by specific events. Before the raid, I had maybe like 65,000 followers. I was what I would call Florida famous, but not really as much on the national scene. And after the raid, George Takai and a couple of other people directed people to my Twitter account. And now I had like 350,000. And since I've been reinstated, I think I'm up to like 400 and some. And I can't just transfer that. Now on TikTok, I have, I think, like 100,000 some, and that's probably the second, but it's very difficult to turn that into a brand new website where I can't even follow all the same people that I was following on Twitter easily. Now, Spoutable, I think, was the only one that made that. You
And that's
can
if they're
transfer
even
your
there.
following, but you can't make people follow you.
Yeah.
So that was very convenient. It's just frustrating.
I've recently started on Spoutable myself, and the whole lack of an algorithm I like, but at the same time, it really punishes you for not having an audience.
Yeah, that makes it more difficult. Like I said, that is the big crux here, is that nobody wants to abandon, let's say, me with 400,000 followers. I can reach millions of people with a single tweet.
What's your biggest source of inspiration for doing what you do, for speaking out, for not altering data, for wanting to get to the bottom, to get to the truth?
I don't know. But yeah, that's kind of like, what made you blow the whistle, or the same kind of question I always get. I just think that's always kind of who I was. Like I mentioned, I did want to be a journalist. I wanted my whole life to be dedicated to finding truths that were inconvenient to powerful people. But I grew up very poor, and I saw the way poor people were demonized in this country, and felt like we were being shamed, like I was being shamed as a child for not having a home for parts of my life. And that seemed like a lie. And I think that when people are being hurt because of lies, that someone has to say something. Me as a kid had no power. I had no voice. I had no means of standing up for myself, or to say, I'm not poor because my parents don't work hard. They both work 2 jobs and they're gone all day. We're poor because of all these systemic things. So when people are going to be harmed, I feel like you have to say something. Otherwise, you're complicit.
All right, so I have a question about anyone who is thinking about becoming a whistleblower. Do you have any advice for somebody who would be thinking about becoming a whistleblower? Because that is such a loaded question, and I guess it depends on what state you're in and what country you're in and who you're
And
blowing the
what type
whistle
of
on.
employee you, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. I have a whistleblower video tagged at the top of my TikTok, but
I'll make sure to link it.
yeah, my biggest advice is to document everything, make backups of everything, export your inbox, save things in a location that's not associated with your work or your company or business or whatever. Because that might be the only thing that saved you. It was what saved me. And so document everything is always the number one rule. Number two is not to trust anybody. You know, like my supervisor always had my back and went to bat for me. And in the end, even he wasn't powerful enough to override higher powers and never spoke out publicly. And so people that you think would stand up for you and fight for you may not when their own careers and their own jobs and their own families are on the line. And it might be too much to ask of them to do that. So don't trust anybody. Don't confide in a coworker. Don't tell anybody but your lawyers. Get
And cover
lawyers, get
your
them
ass.
quickly. Yes. Make sure you're doing everything through the proper channels, or that could come back to bite you. And consider staying anonymous and staying private.
Well, I know you have a Kickstarter for a movie about DeSantis, and
About me.
well, your journey in exposing the slime that is DeSantis.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you're looking forward to doing personally or professionally besides that? I know that is a huge project, and the Kickstarter is underway at the moment. So
Yeah, and we have to raise all of the money by August 4th, or we don't get to keep anything that we've raised, because that's the rule with Kickstarters. Yeah, we're trying to fundraise for that by August 4th. This week is actually National Whistleblower Week, and I'll be in DC for National Whistleblower Day, which will be awesome. And trying really hard to get this out because the story really is much bigger than just me. This isn't just my story. It's not just DeSantis' story. It's Florida's story. It's Florida's COVID story. It's going to be the definitive telling of what happened to us in that state and how it influenced policy nationwide. And everybody has heard by now that there was a documentary being produced by Vice about DeSantis's time at Guantanamo Bay, in which he apparently quite enjoyed the torture of detainees there. That was shut down one day after he declared as a
his
candidate.
run for presidency.
Yes, one day after, because according to the people at Showtime, they were afraid of political retribution. And this man has a heavy influence on the media, more than Trump ever could dream of, because he has people like Jake Tapper in his corner. And it's really important that we tell stories that don't apologize for challenging that narrative.
Looking back, is there anything you would have done differently as a whistleblower? Would you have just tried to keep it to yourself? Would you have still gone the same path and endured this?
I don't know. I
Yeah.
used to say absolutely, I'd do it all over again, but maybe if it was just my losses, I would still say that. But they came after my 13-year-old son for sharing memes making fun of cops in Uvalde
That is so
because it was
heartless.
school shooting related content. I watched them pat him down and put handcuffs on him. And he's autistic, so he's very sensitive about being touched and all that. They took him to jail. I don't know. I don't know.
That's really hard. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
What are some ordinary ways that citizens can engage to help increase transparency in their communities?
That's a good question. I should have thought more about that one. I think you should demand transparency from your local government all the way up. There are too many local people in this country, especially in Florida, who get away with just not telling people everything from how they're spending money to things like COVID. And if enough people demand that there be consequences for not doing that, consequences at the ballot box, of course, then things will change. The problem is we haven't held anybody accountable on a large scale for this. Maybe Trump is finally going to be held accountable.
But look at how long
But
it's taken.
yeah, look how long it's taken and look at the damage that was done in the meantime. We have to somewhat lean on each other to do our best job to demand better.
That's a really great answer. I think that's about all. I really want to thank you for spending the time to come and talk with me. I know you're a very busy person, and this was kind of out of the blue. So I
Yeah, no,
appreciate you
it's fun.
speaking with me.
I don't understand like all the hype around getting people to talk. It's like anybody, I'll talk to anybody. I never thought in a million years I'd ever be in Cosmopolitan magazine. My God. But I did it because I was asked, and I knew I would reach more people, maybe a group of people I normally wouldn't. Never even really read a Cosmopolitan. I hope they don't hate me for that. But beauty magazines aren't really my thing. And that was not, I always grabbed the National Geographic at the checkout aisle, never Cosmopolitan or any of the other stuff. Yeah, I mean, if we restrict who we tell our stories to, then it's not really about telling the truth or sharing our stories. It's just about us. And I don't believe that. So,
Well, thank you once again. It was an absolute honor to speak with you.
you too. And good luck with your future interviews. I
Thank you
hope that
very
you don't get
much.
trolled too hard.
Oh, I'm sure I will.
All right.
Take care. And that concludes our interview with the incredible Rebekah Jones. I want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to you, Rebekah, for taking the time to chat with us today. It's been an absolute honor to have you on the show and hear your powerful insights on transparency, accountability, and the impact of disinformation campaigns. So thank you once again, Rebekah, for sharing your story and your dedication to making a positive impact on society. We'll be cheering you on every step of the way as you continue to be a force for change. And to our viewers, thank you for joining us today. Remember, together we can foster a culture that values honesty, integrity, and the pursuit of truth. Stay tuned for more inspiring interviews and thought-provoking discussion on courageous disclosure. Until next time, take care and stay informed.